The air in my father's living room was thick with the scent of old wood and unspoken resentment. My brother, Mark, stood by the fireplace, his hands tucked into the pockets of his tailored slacks. He always looked like he'd just stepped out of a magazine, even when delivering a verdict. He cleared his throat, his gaze flicking from our mother to our father, before finally landing on me. "Look, it's decided," he said, his voice smooth and final. "Dad can't manage on his own anymore. And since I'm too busy with the firm and my family and you," he pointed a condescending finger at me, "clearly aren't capable. You should move to a nursing home." He said the words to our father, but his eyes were locked on me, daring me to object. My mother nodded in solemn agreement, a carefully practiced look of sorrow on her face. My father, slumped in his favourite armchair, just stared at his hands, defeated. The three of them had planned this. They thought they were cornering me, forcing my hand, deciding my father's fate. They had no idea they were actually finalising the last piece of a trap I had been setting for months. And then, right on cue, the doorbell rang. Mark shot me an annoyed look. "Are you expecting someone?" he snapped. I gave a small, cold smile. "Not someone," I replied, standing up. "Everyone." They didn't realise that this family meeting was not about my father's future, but about their past. They were about to pay for a lifetime of debts, and the collectors were finally at the door. You might be asking why I would do this to my own family. To understand, you have to go back to a promise made over a dusty workbench, a promise that they not only broke, but used to shackle me for 20 years. It all started with the family business, Miller and Son Construction. The sign was painted in my father's youth, a bold declaration of a legacy. But there was a problem. He had two sons. Mark was the golden child. He was smart, charming, and allergic to dirt. From the moment he was born, he was destined for college, for a corner office, for a life far away from sawdust and calloused hands. I, on the other hand, was the one who inherited my father's knack for building things. I was the son in Miller and Son. At least that's what I was told. My role was decided for me before I could even hold a hammer properly. While Mark was studying for his SATs, I was on a roof somewhere, learning how to lay shingles in the summer heat. My father made the promise when I was 16. We were reframing the old Henderson house down by the river, a brutal summer job that left my hands splintered and my back in a permanent state of ache. He clapped a heavy hand on my shoulder, his face slick with sweat. "You've got a gift, kid," he said, his voice rough with pride. "Mark, he's got the book smarts, but you've got the hands. You're the real builder. We're partners. One day, this business, this house, all of it, it'll be yours." Miller and Sons, for real. He sold me a dream and I bought it wholesale. That promise became the foundation upon which I built my entire life. Every dollar the company made, every sacrifice demanded, was an investment in my future, or so I was told. When I got a partial scholarship to a state university for construction management, my mother sat me down. "That's nice, dear," she'd said, stirring her tea. "But your father needs you here. The business is finally getting traction. Mark's tuition at the private university is so expensive. We need you to keep things running." So I stayed. I gave up the scholarship. I gave up friends, parties, and the life of a normal young man. My world was a 6 a.m. alarm, the smell of sawdust, and the constant grinding exhaustion of physical labour. Meanwhile, Mark lived a different life entirely. While I was patching roofs in the rain, he was on spring break in Florida. When I used my small savings to buy a new industrial saw for the business, my parents used the profits from that same month to buy Mark a brand new sedan for his graduation. "He needs to look professional for his internships," my father explained, not even meeting my eye. It was always like that. Mark's needs were investments. My needs were expenses to be avoided. My labour wasn't seen as work. It was my duty. I wasn't an employee or even a partner. I was a tool, a reliable, sturdy tool that they used to build my brother's perfect life, all while my own was slowly being dismantled, piece by piece, under the weight of a promise that was never meant to be kept. For years, I operated on that fuel of a future promise. I convinced myself that every splinter, every aching muscle was a down payment on my destiny. The breaking point came not with a bang, but with a quiet conversation over a Sunday dinner. The business had bought a small, dilapidated property on the outskirts of town a few years back. It was a wreck, but I saw its potential. For 3 years, I spent every spare weekend, every evening, rebuilding it from the ground up. I poured my own skills, my own sweat, and what little money I had into that place. I considered it my masterpiece, the first real asset that was more mine than anyone else's. Then, one day, my father announced he'd sold it. "Got a fantastic offer from a developer," he beamed, passing the mashed potatoes. "The profit is going to give us some breathing room." I felt a surge of pride, thinking us meant the business. I thought we'd finally upgrade the old truck or invest in some modern equipment. I was a fool. A week later, Mark and his new wife, Jessica, announced they'd bought a sprawling 4-bedroom house in the city's most expensive suburb. At their housewarming party, my mother, beaming with pride, raised a glass of champagne. "We're just so thrilled we could give you kids a good start," she announced to the guests. "Selling that old investment property really gave us the windfall we needed to help with their down payment." The air left my lungs. The casualness of it, the way my 3 years of labour were reduced to a windfall, the way the profits were siphoned directly from the business I was bleeding for into my brother's pocket. It was a betrayal so profound it felt like a physical blow. That night, after the party, I confronted my father in his workshop. I asked him about our partnership, about the promise. He wouldn't look at me. He just fiddled with a wrench on his workbench. "It's all for the family, son," he mumbled. "Mark has a wife now, a future. He needed the help." My mother overheard and stepped in, her voice sharp. "Why are you being so selfish? You have a roof over your head. Mark is building a life. Your brother's success is our success." Her words finally severed the last thread of hope. I wasn't a partner. I wasn't even a son. I was an asset, and they had just liquidated me. That night, something inside me broke, but it healed back wrong. It healed back cold and hard, like steel. I didn't yell or argue anymore, I just nodded. I went back to work the next day, and the day after that. To my family, it looked like I had finally accepted my role. They mistook my silence for surrender. In reality, it was the silence of a predator learning the patterns of its prey. I stopped seeing the business as my future inheritance and started seeing it for what it was, a crime scene, and I began gathering the evidence. For the next 2 years, I lived a double life. By day, I was the dutiful son, the family workhorse, running Miller & Son construction by myself as my father's health began to slowly decline. But by night, my bedroom became a forensic accounting office. I found a dusty old ledger in the basement and started documenting every hour I worked, unpaid. I photocopied every invoice for materials I had paid for out of my own pocket. I went through years of bank statements, highlighting every suspicious transfer from the business account to Mark's, funds for his student loans, his car payments, his honeymoon. They weren't even trying to hide it. Why would they? The family mule wasn't supposed to know how to read a balance sheet. I documented the value I had added to every project, especially my parents' own home, which I had practically rebuilt over the years. A new kitchen, a finished basement, a deck. All of it was my labour, my time, my skill. I was building their retirement nest egg while they denied me even a basic salary. The final piece fell into place when I secretly consulted a lawyer in a neighbouring town. I laid out 20 years of exploitation on his mahogany desk. He listened intently, his expression shifting from sympathy to shock, and finally to a kind of grim satisfaction. When I was done, he leaned back in his leather chair. "They didn't just take you for granted," he said, his voice low. "What they've done constitutes decades of wage theft, unjust enrichment, and breach of partnership. You're not just their son, you are their single biggest creditor." He gave me a plan. A quiet, methodical plan that required one last thing from my family, one final, public act of overreach. And as my father's health worsened, I knew they would provide it. My father's strong hands, the ones that had taught me how to frame a wall and grip a hammer, grew frail. His steps faltered, and his memory, once as sharp as a nail, began to cloud. I became his full-time caregiver on top of being the sole engine of the business. I'd put in a 10-hour day on a job site, then come home to cook his dinner, manage his medications, and help him get ready for bed. My mother would watch from the living room sofa, sighing about how difficult it all was for her. Mark would call once a week, a perfunctory 2-minute check-in before he launched into a monologue about a big case he'd won or a vacation he was planning. Their concern wasn't for my father's comfort, but for his assets. Mark and Jessica started visiting more often, their eyes scanning the house, the workshop, the half-acre of land it sat on. I'd overhear them whispering in the kitchen about property values and capital gains tax. They saw my father not as a person, but as a portfolio of assets that needed to be liquidated efficiently. They saw me as the live-in groundskeeper, a temporary inconvenience to be dealt with. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. They had used my father's business to fund Mark's ascent, and now they were going to use my father's decline to fund their next chapter. The call came on a Tuesday. It was Mark. "We're having a family meeting on Sunday," he announced, no room for discussion in his voice. "Mum and I have decided on the best course of action for Dad. We need to be practical." I knew exactly what was coming. This was it. The public overreach my lawyer had talked about. They were going to try and remove my father, the final obstacle to selling the property, and in the same breath, they would try to get rid of me. They assumed I would just roll over, the same way I always had. "Okay, Mark. I'll be there," I said, my voice even. After I hung up, I made 2 calls. The first was to my lawyer, to confirm the time. The second was to a certified public accountant who specialized in forensic audits. I told them both to be at the house at 2:15 p.m. on Sunday. The trap was now officially set. All I had to do was let the prey walk into it. I walked to the front door, the weight of my family's stares on my back. Mark was already muttering, "If this is one of your construction buddies, tell them to go away." I opened the door. Standing on the porch were a man and a woman in sharp dark suits, holding leather briefcases. They looked completely out of place in our dusty working-class neighborhood. I stepped aside. "Please, come in," I said. They entered the living room, and the atmosphere changed instantly. The casual, domestic cruelty of the moment evaporated, replaced by a cold, formal tension. My mother clutched the pearls at her neck. Mark straightened up, his lawyer instincts kicking in, sensing a threat. "I'm sorry, who are you?" he demanded, using his courtroom voice. "This is a private family meeting." The man, a stern-looking gentleman with silvering temples, stepped forward and placed his briefcase on the coffee table with a soft click. "My name is David Chen," he said, his voice cutting through the silence. "I am legal counsel for your brother." He nodded towards me. "And this is Ms. Evelyn Reed, a forensic accountant." Mark actually scoffed, a short barking laugh full of disbelief. "Legal counsel? For what? Did you slip on a nail, little brother? Are you suing us for an allowance?" Mr. Chen didn't even smile. He opened his briefcase and retrieved a thick, spiral-bound document. "I am here on my client's behalf to formalize the dissolution of the de facto partnership known as Miller & Son Construction," he stated calmly. and to demand immediate restitution for 2 decades of unpaid labour, wage theft, and fraudulent conveyances. Before Mark could even process the words, Ms. Reed stepped forward, placing 3 identical documents on the table. "This," she said, her voice crisp and emotionless, "is the preliminary audit. By our conservative estimate, your brother is owed back wages, overtime, and penalties totaling $483,000. Furthermore, we have traced an additional $312,000 in business funds that were improperly diverted for personal use, namely for your education, vehicles, and the down payment on your home, Mark." She slid a copy across the table to him. Mark's face went from crimson with anger to a pasty, sickly white. My mother gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. My father just looked on, utterly lost. The meeting about putting him in a home was officially over. The meeting about how they were going to pay back every cent they had stolen from me had just begun. Mark's face cycled through a series of emotions: disbelief, rage, and then finally the dawning horror of a man who recognizes the bars of a cage snapping shut around him. As a lawyer, he understood the document in his hands wasn't a bluff. It was an execution order for his entire life. He threw the audit onto the coffee table. "This is insane! It's extortion!" he snarled, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You think you can just walk in here with some ambulance chaser and a hired gun and threaten your own family? I'll countersue you into oblivion." Mr. Chen didn't flinch. He simply opened a second folder. "By all means, please do," he said, his tone icy. "The discovery process will be illuminating. We have 20 years of supplier invoices paid from my client's personal bank account. We have sworn affidavits from 3 dozen subcontractors who will testify they only ever dealt with him, that he was, for all intents and purposes, the sole operator of the business. We have your university tuition statements paid directly from the business account. Most damningly," he paused, letting the words hang in the air, "we have the business's tax filings. I'm sure the IRS will be very interested to learn how a company can have an unpaid, full-time employee for 2 decades. That's not just a civil liability, Mr. Miller, that's criminal tax fraud." A choked sob escaped from my mother. Mark sank back into his chair as if his strings had been cut. I finally spoke, my voice calm and low, cutting through the thick silence. "You're right about one thing, Mark. This isn't a negotiation." I stood up and walked to the fireplace, turning to face them. I was no longer the quiet son in the corner. I was their creditor, and I was here to collect. "Here is what is going to happen," I said. "First, the business, all of it, the name, the tools, the truck, the client list, will be signed over to me today. Second, this house will be put on the market by the end of the month. A significant portion of the proceeds will be placed in a trust, managed by my lawyer, to pay for Dad's care in the best facility I can find. He will be comfortable. Third, Mark, you will sign a legally binding agreement to repay the $312,000 you stole with interest. We'll arrange a payment plan you can surely afford on your lawyer's salary." Mr. Chen slid the prepared documents across the table. "You will sign these papers right now," I finished, "or tomorrow morning we file the lawsuit and Ms. Reed forwards her audit to the IRS. Your choice." Silence hung in the room, heavy and suffocating. Mark stared at the papers, his face a mask of utter defeat. The fight had drained out of him, replaced by the grim reality of his situation. My mother was openly weeping now, quiet, hopeless sobs. Mr. Chen calmly placed a pen on top of the documents. For what felt like an eternity, nobody moved. Then, with a shuddering breath, Mark reached for the pen. His signature was a jagged, angry scratch on the paper. My mother followed, her hand guided by my lawyer's gentle but firm direction. My father, in a moment of brief lucidity, simply looked at me, a flicker of confusion in his eyes, before signing where he was told. As Mr. Chen gathered the signed documents, my mother finally looked at me, her face streaked with tears. "How could you?" she whispered, her voice trembling with a lifetime of weaponized guilt. "After all we've given you, we are your family." I looked back at her, not with the anger she expected, but with a profound and empty calm. The power her words once held over me was gone forever. "You're wrong," I said, my voice even. "You never gave me anything. I built it, and you took it. You didn't raise a son, you raised a tool to build my brother's life. You don't get to call yourself my family now that the tool is collecting its fee." I turned to my brother. "You wanted Dad in a nursing home to make things simple for you. Well, now he'll be in a good one, and you'll be paying for it. For the rest of us, this family is dissolved." With that, I turned and walked out of the room. I didn't look back. I went to the workshop, the one place that had always been my sanctuary and my prison. I picked up the old, rusty toolbox my father had given me as a boy, the one thing in this whole place that felt truly mine. I carried it out to my truck, not bothering to say goodbye. As I pulled away, I saw them through the window. 2 people sitting in the ruins of the life they had built on my back. The next morning, I returned to the workshop alone. I took a crowbar and slowly, deliberately, pried the old, faded Miller & Son construction sign from the front of the building. It came off with a groan of protesting nails. I let it fall to the dirt. I was no longer a son in that sense. I was the owner, my own man. The future was mine to build, and this time I was building it for myself.